So I'm Vikas Mehrotra. I teach at the University of Alberta in Canada, and I'm here today to talk about family businesses and succession practices and exit modes and so on in post-war Japan. The reason this is a topic that should be of interest to all family businesses even outside Japan is that succession is the sort of Achilles heel in family businesses, in the sense that if you have one weak link, that can be the end of the dynasty. So the issue we are talking about here is how do Japanese businesses deal with succession issues? And one can easily exaggerate differences between Japan and the rest of the world, but in this one regard, they are truly unique. And that is in regards to the practice of adult adoptions. And this is interesting. Maybe most of you are not even familiar with what I'm talking about. Japan and the US share the honor of being the two biggest adopting countries in the world. The big difference is in the US, 98% of the adoptees are babies and children. By contrast, in Japan, 98% of the adoptees are adult males. And why do they do this? The main reason is that they value the house, by house I mean the house of business, more than their own progeny. And so it is more important for them to have continuity in the house than to put their own blood sons in the position of the next generation to manage the business. And how do they do this adoption? Typically, the adoptee is someone they have observed for a number of years. Typically, the adoptee is obviously from a good university. And to be totally blunt here, when you have a baby, there's a bit of an uncertainty about how smart the baby is. When you're dealing with a 28-year-old adult, you can pick and choose. And that's what happens in a number of instances in Japan. So we talk about some examples, how some companies, for example, in India, everyone is familiar with Suzuki. I'm not sure how many of you knew that all of the CEOs of Suzuki have been adopted. And so in that sense, the current patriarch, Mr. Isamu Suzuki, he had two of his own sons, but he was grooming his adopted son to be the next CEO. It turns out his adopted son, unfortunately, he died young, in his 50s, and that meant that his own sons were presumably next in line to be the CEO, but that was not the custom, that was not the tradition at Suzuki. So as a result, Mr. Isamu, he came back from retirement, and he's now the chairman of the Suzuki Group again, because it is not in the Suzuki tradition to have your blood sons be the next CEOs. Now, it may well happen, but that's one example for you. The next question is, does it help? Does it even matter? Is it just some tradition that is a meaningless diversion? And the answer depends on how you measure performance and so on. So what we did in one of the papers I'm going to talk about is we looked at the performance of Japanese companies which were headed by adopted sons, and we compared performance of the same companies, including actually other companies as well, which were headed by blood sons as well as by professional managers who are unrelated to the family. And then sort of you can think of this as a horse race now. And in this horse race, we have adopted sons, we have blood sons, and we have professional managers. And then we let the data talk. And the data tell us that both in terms of profitability and in terms of sales growth and so on, adopted sons actually do the best. And then next are blood sons, who in turn beat professional managers. The one group I've left out here are founders. Founders actually do better than all three. But then we can't really take much out of that because we only look at companies managed by founders that are listed. So we don't see the companies managed by founders that were not lucky enough to be listed. So it's a little bit more difficult to draw inferences out of watching the listed company's performance under founders. So that's one of the topics we're going to talk about. The other topic I'm going to talk about is, why do families exit the businesses that they have founded through sweat and equity and so on? And that also is a topic that is worthy of at least empirical investigation. And here, what we find here is that in many cases, at least in Japan, in many cases, family ownership does decline over time. This is a universal phenomenon. This happens in Europe, this happens in America because of growth, because of finance. Finance means that you need capital to grow. As you bring in external capital, your own personal stake in the business becomes smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And yet, what we noticed in Japan is that there are many companies, for example, Toyota, for example, Casio Motors, for Casio Calculators, for example, even Suzuki, where the ownership of the founding family is zero or almost zero. And yet, they are running the businesses. So that's a question that we have to ask. Why is the family asked to come back and run businesses in which they have no ownership? We also find that in some cases families actually keep ownership, but they're not interested in managing the business. So what they do instead is they bring in professional managers. And so we want to understand what factors make the family decide, should they bring in professional managers, should they sell their ownership, should they keep managing the business even when they don't have any ownership, or in the rarest of cases, just lock, stock, barrel, do a complete exit. So this is the part of the second part of the talk that I'm going to do today. Why don't we see female adoptees, especially adult adoptees? And we haven't come across, at least in the post-war sample that we have, which means 1950 onwards, not a single instance of that. Now, pre-war, you can go back 700-800 years in Japan to look at the registries and so on. Female adoption was very rare. Why is that? Because adoption was primarily a tool for succession planning. And succession planning, not just in Japan, but also in Europe and so on, was basically an issue that was weighed in favor of males. So adoption of females in Japan, because it was related to succession, was exceedingly rare. There's also some evidence that when the Americans occupied Japan after the war, they were sort of not very sympathetic to this whole tradition of adult adoptions in Japan. In particular, they were concerned that female adoptions could be used for practices including prostitution and so on, which is not good. So for a variety of reasons, female adoptions were not popular in Japan.